Hello and welcome to part 2 of my Parade's End analysis. This episode I've entitled To Stir Oneself. And what do I mean by that? Well, of course we're looking at the main character of Parade's End, Christopher Tietjens, and in this episode his stirring, i.e. his decision to go to war, join the army. Not, of course, when the war is in its full flow, or in its full mire, to be more apt, in 1916, but rather he decides to do it quite close to the outbreak of war in the autumn of 1914. So that's why it's to stir oneself. It's Tietjens' decision. And part 2 is all about getting from the 1911 world of episode 1, where we discussed Tietjens' marital problems, the pressures he's been under in his professional life, wherein he meets Valentine Wannop, the young suffragette, idealistic, youthful, one that can challenge him intellectually. And that makes him think more about his marriage to Sylvia. She's eloped, he's going to take her back, but the setting is one of thin calm, under which much is bubbling. You have to get that from that 1911 world to the 1914 world, in which those who believed in the perpetual peace, those who believed in Pax Britannica going on the 20th century without much disturbance, are shocked. So the decadence seeps into right up until the cusp of England's declaration of war against Germany. So this feeling of how you get from 1911 to 1914 is not really done in the book. It's one of these great retrospectives where the first book, Some Do Not, part 2, picks up with Tietjens having already joined the war and having come back with a certain sense of shell shock. I mean, it's not the end of the war in part 2, but you're in media res. The war is in the middle of its torment, and so Stoppard, most of the events of that when Tietjens comes back for his brief period is going to be detailed in episode 3. So the actual scenes occurring in book 1, Some Do Not, part 2, line up more with episode 3, and the recollections that the characters have of what happened between 1911 scenes and their current scenes is what Stoppard puts into his episode 2. The transition of the 1911 world to the 1914 world. So this is probably Stoppard's greatest solo scene. I mean, some of the remembrances and reminiscences are so vivid that they do kind of become clear scenes, and we'll see that very clearly with what Tom Stoppard decided would be his final scene for episode 2, which was Tietjens' final confrontation with Valentine in 1914 before he goes to war. But this is the episode where Stoppard has been given greatest freedom, and you see it. This is probably his best achievements come in this episode because he has less to go off. He's trying to piece back all of the separate scenes, and so he starts by dropping you straight into Tietjens taking Sylvia back. He arrives in Germany and he has news that his mother has died. Now, the mother, as we established in the first scene, is seen certainly by Christopher's brother Mark as a source of his sentimentality. Brought him up soft, made him soft. So the mother dying at the start of episode 2 is another rupture into the reasons Tietjens could be seen to stay on with his parade. Where he's going to have to agree that the end of England has now occurred to such an extent there's nothing left to do but to stir oneself once the opportunity arrives, and he sees that opportunity in 1914. So the loss of the mother is the beginning of the stirring, because it knocks you into a more heightened mode. The comfort of the one who reared you is gone. So Stoppard opens with the death of the mother, but he's already decided to take back Sylvia, and Tietjens arrives in this little Satterthwaite trio of Mrs. Satterthwaite, Sylvia, and of course their family priest, Father Consett in the Black Forest. And we had a scene establishing these three characters in the first part. And of course we know that Sylvia, in the meantime, is hell-bent on, though taking Christopher back and though to a certain extent being chased, wants to, quote, this is from Ford, to let him, Tietjens, know the mortification of failure. Her objective is going to be to torment him. That's her raison d'etre now. Tietjens, of course, arrives in the scene and knows, Stopper gives us a nice little bit between himself and Father Consett, where we said, though Consett is fire and brimstone Catholicism against Tietjens' Anglican sainthood, there's a certain agreement where both see themselves as idealists living in a world of decadence, and there's a strange sort of respect there. And there's, of course, the overtures that Consett is in Berlin on Irish duties, i.e. smuggling arms into Ireland, or trying to get the Germans as antagonists to help with the Irish independence movement. Sylvia also believes, still in her own state, self-censored state at this point, that she is the source of Christopher's mother's death. She believes that she's basically died of a broken heart. Tietjens, of course, still takes on the hard outer persona. Perhaps to a certain extent he does believe this, but he calls it a literary convention, and that she died of a medical illness. So he's still putting up the parade at this point, though in a strange sense, despite Sylvia wanting to establish that from a self-centered point of view, she may have some truth there. Tietjens, at a certain level, recognizes that. And so we have to go back and do the funeral scene. Now, this whole transition of German Forest, Tietjens taking Sylvia back to funeral scene, is mainly Stoppard's making. We know the mother died. We know that Sylvia did think that she was the source of it, the broken heart. But how the actions play out with the specific scenes, Tietjens actually going back to her in Germany, not really established in that method. The funeral outside Groby, not really established in that method. But what it does to have the funeral outside Groby is give us a chance to look at Christopher's brother Mark and his father, who remains nameless. He's just known as Mr. Tietjens throughout the novel, to establish Mark and Mr. Tietjens. And also, of course, to get more familiar with the Groby setting, because we ended the last episode with Tietjens admitting to Valentine Valentine stating to Tietjens that he would never take her to Groby. And here is Ford's description of Groby on page 183. Again, I'm using the Penguin Classics version. The moors were like enough to those above Groby to make them happy. It was the hard, frugal life of his desire, and his mind was at rest. His mind was at rest because there was going to be a war. And then we go into the Christopher's permutations upon the war at that point, but we see that there's this setting of Groby. They lived in a bare, grim farmhouse, drank great quantities of buttermilk, and ate great quantities of Wensleydale. That you're back in amongst the Yorkshiremen. Sort of, he's back home. He sees Michael growing up, his son, and perhaps sees it at this point. We're 1912 now, and Stoppard's 1911 to 14 transition. Perhaps sees an ability that he can take Sylvia back and live up this parade. Mark won't marry or sire. The heir to Groby will pass to Christopher and then on to Michael. We also have the first mention of Mr. Tietjens mentioning to Mark to set up the Wannop boy, that being Valentine's brother Edward, through Eton, and then to the same old Cambridge colleges that his father went to. So this again establishes another piece of the doubt. The first doubt is whether the child of Christopher, Michael, is indeed his, or whether he belongs to one Gerald Drake that Sylvia was with beforehand. The second doubt now is whether or not one of the Wannops, one of the Wannop children, is actually the child of Mr. Tietjens. And yes, if it's true and it's Valentine, then that implies any relationship between Christopher and Valentine is semi-incestuous. So he wants to put the Edward Wannop Valentine's brother, through college. Does Mr. Tietjens, this being Christopher's father, want to do this as is the ostensible way to put his friend's son through Eton? The friend has died. Tietjens has the wealth, the Wannops less so. This is established. So that's the nice side. But the other side is there's always rumours. This is the societal rumours of the last days of England. Endless gossip. And we'll see throughout episode 2 and 3 how this sort of gossiping and endless gossiping can often take on the form of misinformation. And then that provides doubt, which destabilises the home front. So this is just another aspect of it. Is one of the Wannops actually some sort of an offspring of a fling between Mr. Tietjens and Mrs. Wannop? Of course, if that's true, the implications on the Christopher Valentine relationship is quite sinister. It's dealt with as harrowing thoughts mainly for Mark Tietjens in the book, but rather than in the series where they don't go as far into it, but it's there nonetheless. Let's look at how part 2 opens with an establishment of Sylvia Tietjens' character, because we need to get a good description of her that we haven't got yet, and from Ford's point of view, and we get that straight away at the opening chapters of part 2. Here are the opening paragraphs by Ford. Sylvia Tietjens rose from her end of the lunch table and swayed along it, carrying her plate. She still wore her hair in bandeau and her skirts as long as she possibly could. She didn't, she said with her height, intend to be taken for a girl guide. She hadn't in complexion, in figure, or in the languor of her gestures aged by a minute. You couldn't discover in the skin of her face any deadness, in her eyes that shade more of fatigue than she intended to express, but she had purposefully increased her air of scornful insolence. That was because she felt that her hold over men increased to the measure of her coldness. Someone she knew had once said of a dangerous woman that when she entered the room every woman kept her husband on the leash. It was Sylvia's pleasure to think that, before she went out of that room, all the women in it realised with mortification that they needn't. For if coolly and distinctly she had said on entering, "Nothing doing," as barmaids will to the enterprising, she could more plainly have conveyed to the other women that she had no use for their treasured rubbish. So there's Ford's description of Sylvia. Of course, at this point, she's still living along that life. Though she says, yes, I'll go back, I'll be chaste, she still doesn't quite fulfill this. I mean, you have people such as Brownlee come after her, and we'll see the establishment of the character Brownlee. Now recall, she's now had 3 separate flings, including Brownlee. One's the Brownlee character. He's a sort of bumbling banker. Gets established in this episode. She will have had Gerald Drake from before when she knew Christopher. She will have had Potty Perrone, whom she eloped with in episode 1. And probably the most naive fool, but quite an upper class boy, Brownlee the banker, who will get established in this one. So those are 3 flings separate to Christopher. And though she'll remain to try and be chaste for a number of years, in the book, of course, that is all remembered as her attempt to be chaste. But in the series, we have to actually see that effort a little bit more. So we see her go to a convent. Her friends in society don't take this seriously. There's a genuine belief, though, that she does take it seriously, but not for long. The resolve is not great enough. So the other set of characters we need to know about the 1911 to 14 transition is the Wannops. And so we know Valentine Wannop fairly well from the scenes that were established for her already, but her mother, the writer that Christopher respects, needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. And also her brother needs to be introduced, Edward Wannop, the man Mr. Tietjens is putting through Eton. Now, the Edward Wannop character is quite a minor character, but he is an interesting little vignette created by Ford, and, in fairness to Stoppard, fairly well portrayed. He's the one whose money, that being of Mr. Tietjens, is putting him through the best education in the land. Unbeknownst to him, to be fair, but he actually has an extremely privileged position bestowed to him, and there's no sense of noblesse oblige here, because, you know, there to Groby is Tietjens and all of this. This is simply Edward Wannop, young boy, going through Eton, Cambridge, best schools, all the rest, because of an old friendship, if you believe the side you want to on that. You know, the Mr. Tietjens was dutiful to his wife, etc. Then it's the old friendship between Mr. Wannop and Mr. Tietjens that's sending him through. What does Edward Wannop turn into out of all this? Well, of course, he turns into a raging communist, because he's going through Eton, and this is going to be the beginnings of the sort of, you know, the upper class. We've had the decadence, but now will come the malfeasance, or the malevolence of what will eventually grow into, you know, the Cambridge Five into the 20s and 30s. But we're not there yet. It's still a seed of thought that starts to circle around these upper class areas, and Wannop falls straight into that. This being Edward Wannop. So he's come from an extremely privileged position, and yet all he really has to say for himself is everything he sees about England is abhorrent. It needs to be overturned in revolt. Again, this is mainly told in the book through the eyes of Valentine. Here's Ford. Her brother had done admirably at Eton, taking such a number of exhibitions and things that once at Magdalen. Apologies, he goes to Magdalen College, Oxford. Perhaps it's just the Cambridge Five playing in my head there. So he's in Magdalen, taking such a number of exhibitions and things that once at Magdalen he had been nearly off his mother's hands. An admirable gay boy, not unlikely to run for, as well as being a credit to, his university, if he didn't get sent down for his political extravagances. He was a communist. And then, of course, the mother, Mrs. Wannop, starts writing for some sort of Tory circular, usually using Christopher Tietjens as a source of interesting views. And we'll get to this, where Tietjens, in 1912, 1913, he's beginning to predict that there will be a war soon. This is recollected in the book, but it's mainly through his ability to, you know, study particular stats and figures in his Imperial Department of Statistics that lead him to do this. So it's you can say that's it's a materialistic calculation. It's all about the laying of Russian tracks and the time it'll take for the Russians to mobilize, and what that means for Germany's political pressure to complete a war with France on the other front. And he kind of figures all of this out and realizes that if Germany wait too long, they won't be able to fight the effective war on two fronts. He doesn't mention the Schlieffen Plan, of course, but it effectively says, you know, they'll have to go to France first. All of this is detailed. I mean, Ford is writing in the 20s, so he knows as much as he knows at that point. I'm not sure how later everyone could solidify their theory of what was actually going on in the minds of German high command in those years of 1913. I think you can all read books such as Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers, for instance, to get a wider sense of the European picture. But Tietjens has a pretty good grasp on it, and it's done through materialistic means, kind of like you see a lot of those historians do it. Neil Ferguson's Pity of War, etc., even a century later. So, although alluded to by Ford, it's not a disastrous illusion considering he was writing in the 20s.
The cost of losing our export trade to the continent. Do you think there will be a war?
If Germany puts it off for much longer, Russia will have enough railway to put her army on the frontier in 20 days. So the Germans are in a panic. It'll take them twice that long to beat France. And they don't want to be fighting on two fronts.
Goodness. Things you chaps in London know.
And then, of course, we have the other final set of secondary characters that we need to know what happens in the 1911 to 14 period in, and that is, of course, the Mr. and Mrs Duchemin, and trying to get in on that situation, Tietjens' friend, Macmaster. Mrs. Duchemin, also called Edith, or Edith Ethel, as she was known before she married Mr. Duchemin, engages in a sexual passion with Macmaster, and we see in part 2 the end of her relationship with Mr. Duchemin. His insanity gets the better of him, and he's eventually exposed. None of this happens in a critical scene in the book. It's just slowly revealed that there is this piece that apparently he did beat her in a frenzy at one point, not out of some sort of sinister domestic violence piece, but that, he sees like Beelzebub in her, or he sees some sort of demon occupying her spirit, that sort of level of insanity. You remember Mr. Duchemin is the ascetic. He's representative of the decline of the benevolent reverend, the Dr. Thomas Arnold figure. And so, in the eyes of at least a Valentine Wannop, the passion, this is Ford's words, the passion of Macmaster for Edith Ethel, and of Edith Ethel for Macmaster, had seemed to her one of the beautiful things of life, right? She's trying to get out of this horrible grasp of Mr. Duchemin and escape with this pre-Raphaelite critic, Macmaster, who's got a good up-and-coming job at the Imperial Department of Statistics. They seem to swim in a sea of renunciations, of beautiful quotations, and of steadfast waiting. Macmaster did not interest her personally much, that being Valentine, through who you're seeing this recollection. But she took him on trust because of Edith Ethel's romantic passion, and because he was Christopher Tietjens' friend. She took it for granted that he was the right man, much as you take it for granted the engine of an express train in which you are is reliable. The right people chosen it for you. And again, that's an insight into Valentine's own naivety at that point. She just assumes that the right sort of relationships are happening. Mr. Duchemin was going insane. These were two passionate beings, Edith and Macmaster, Vincent Macmaster. And so it was only right. The affair was only right. But of course, the whole point of Parade's End is going to be about, do you stand for monogamy and chastity? As Tietjens puts it. Does that then haunt you if you go for it too far? Are we always looking for the excuses to have the affair? Of course, this one is meant to be, the Edith and Macmaster one, meant to be one of the easier ones that you can sympathise with because of the insanity of Mr. Duchemin. Yet still there's that flavour of Valentine is going with the zeitgeist which deems it okay to have the affair. The parade that Tietjens is putting up is gone, except for in a handful of characters. He's the last holdout, and Wannop, though she believes at the start in the relationship, has her own holdout of naivety that many others having the affairs don't necessarily have themselves. Now there'll be a lot to say on where Macmaster and Edith Ethel Duchemin go. You'll see that mainly in episode 3, but safe to say episode 2 establishes the beginning of their affair and their relationship, but they are the social climbers, they are the riders, and we'll see where they go in episode 3 once their relationship has been established. It's an interesting duality between the choices Valentine Wannop and Edith Ethel make in men. Of course, Macmaster and Tietjens both come down to Sussex for that golf club scene at the same time, and were exposed in Breakfast to Duchemin scene in episode 1 to them at the same time. Valentine will ultimately find her love to be that of authenticity. Recall how she knew all of the stories and facts going through the Sussex and Kent countryside in the first book. And Edith Ethel, it will like more the superficiality of being the social climber, and also the superficiality of being the great hostess with her literary intellect and knowledge, of course mainly centered around the Rossettis and Browning and these sort of characters. But for her, there's still a great show, and because she likes the show and not the authentic piece itself, she goes for Macmaster. Valentine actually likes the land. The authenticity is much more earthly in her admirations and love of things. She goes for Christopher Tietjens. It's an interesting duality to think of. There are some scenes Stoppard entirely inserts to flesh out the 1911 to 14 transition, one of which is, showing a bit more Valentine suffragette protests and how she eventually gets disillusioned with that. So by the time you come back during the war, she's not really full-fledged suffragette as she was at the beginning. And so to do this, he gives her a scene where she heads into the National Portrait Gallery. It also establishes us clearly in a time and place. So he puts her, Valentine, into the National Gallery on the 10th of March 1914, where a painting known as the Rokeby Venus was slashed by a suffragette named Mary Richardson. So Stoppard inserts Valentine into the scene, and it shows her, she's staring at all these pictures in the gallery, loving the heritage, the great art and great heritage that she sees around her. She respects the museum, even though at this point women don't have the vote. She can look at great art and respect it. Suffragette comes in and slashes the painting. Actually did happen. Mary Richardson's a real person. Stoppard puts her into that scene. And of course gives you something more visceral about her disillusionment, rather than Ford, who drops you back into her mid-war scenes, and it's more as if the onslaught of the war had wiped off her innocence, and her suffragette involvement was kind of that of an innocent.
What are you all gawping at? Do you think that is all women are good for?
Stoppard can then also cleverly use paintings to establish the Brownlee-Sylvia relationship straight from the Valentine Wannops scene into Sylvia with Brownlee at a more modern art gallery, where they're looking at post-impressionist paintings. Brownlee, of course, doesn't have a clue what he's doing. Sylvia, to a certain extent, is trying to admire it on the level of Tietjens, but of course Tietjens wouldn't like any of the post-impressionisms. And then she doesn't like Brownlee's incomprehension of the artistic movement he's seeing. But even though she kind of more likes the post-impressionist painters, I think it's a Gauguin in front of them. In episode 2, she brings back to Tietjens a landscape painting from the 1790s of Tom Gherkin on a topographical tour, right? So it's right back into the 18th century. It's Tietjens's point of nostalgia, and also his great idealistic taste that the 18th century was a wondrous century. And so it's again a Stoppard invention, but what it does, it's 3 paintings to link the whole scene back together, and also to more cleverly link the love triangle. You have to remember, the HBO BBC series will want to more strongly go with the love triangle aspect to keep viewers hooked, right? This was meant to be in around 2012 a production that could be a sort of Downton Abbey's with your thinking cap on. But of course they don't want the thinking cap too much on, because they still want to hook in the viewers, so you give the little love triangle scenes. But Stoppard does it well by using these 3 paintings to flush you through the London world of spring 1914. And of course, with the suffragette attack on the Rokeby Venus, you get the knowledge that you're in spring 1914. We also in part 2 get the establishment of what will eventually be Christopher's downfall, his ruin, which he comes back to after the war in part 2 of Some Do Not. And it's all about the money problem. So we've set up that Sylvia is going to be having a relationship with this man Brownlee, though not having a full relationship. This is where her ability to be chaste comes out. Brownlee could have been a full-on Perron episode, but he's not going to be, and that's going to frustrate Brownlee. He's not going to have his fun with Sylvia, basically. But Brownlee's the banker, so we've established that threat, right? So where's the money come in? Well, Mrs Duchemin, Edith Ethel, has begun her affair with Macmaster at this time, and they're trying to get Mr Duchemin put away to a rectory. In the meantime, Mr Duchemin owns the purse strings over Mrs Duchemin. Macmaster has humble origins. He does not have much money of himself. Now, there was a mechanism through which Mrs Duchemin could be seen to be spending that money, but Tietjens puts this down because it's not the honourable position, and instead sends the necessary money to Macmaster. Not in the form of a loan in Tietjens' mind, but as again, this is Tietjens embellishing his role as heir to Groby, his noblesse oblige. Macmaster wants it to be a loan, and then of course later on all of this will frustrate Mrs Duchemin because she doesn't want her lover, her choice of social climber, Vincent Macmaster, to be seen to be lesser than Tietjens, both in intellect and also of course in wealth. And so it's going to set Mrs Duchemin and Christopher Tietjens on a collision course. So you now have Mrs Duchemin and Mr Tietjens on a collision course. You have Brownlee and Mr Tietjens on a collision course. And we'll see all of this come to a head in the next part. Ford, of course, as we've already said, opens his part 2 of Some Do Not with Sylvia Tietjens reflecting on what has happened to her since the war. In it, there's quite a vivid scene of them having a picnic outing right on the eve of the war. You know, at this point, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand has occurred, and everyone's talking about what's going to happen next. Will Austria declare war? Will that have larger implications? Also, from the home front setting, Ireland and women still dominate. Very few people are actually talking about the war, but of course, Christopher sees it as the great looming presence. And so Sylvia reflects on this scene, and she heads off to the edge of a cliff to gaze at an eagle. Stoppard uses this recollection to give Christopher and Sylvia at the edge of the cliff, literally and metaphorically in 1914, their own scenes together, their last scene together in peacetime. Christopher realised at this point the war is going to happen. He's going to stir himself, and hence the cliff edge. But here's Ford at the start of on page 144. Sylvia stayed for a long time watching the convulsions of the eagle. It pleased her to see that, though nothing threatened the gulls, they yet screamed and dropped their herrings. The whole affair reminded her of herself and her relationship to the ordinary women of the barnyard. Not that there was the breath of a scandal against herself, that she very well knew, and it was her preoccupation just as turning down nice men, the really nice men, of commerce, was her hobby. So she seized this eagle. She practiced every kind of turning down these creatures, the really nice ones with the Kitchener moustaches, the sealed browns, the eyes, the honest, thrilling voices, the clipped words, straight backs, and admirable records. So to her, this is what the eagle still represents, but Tietjens, it seems to represent something far more earth-shattering. That it is the cliff edge is the war, and that all of Europe's going to be convulsed in it. So, what sets Tietjens to stir himself? We've done decent backgrounds into what happens to these characters in the years 1911 to 1914. And we get one final piece that sets Tietjens to stir himself, and this is where he aids Macmaster. Macmaster is having a summer retreat with Mrs Duchemin up in Scotland. They get seen by a third person who knows they shouldn't be together, and so Christopher has to get up on his train. Remember, he's in Groby, so he's in Yorkshire, he's not too far from Edinburgh at this point. Christopher aids Macmaster. He'll bring Mrs Duchemin down the train, and of course they're spotted by who else but Campion again, and his sister, who's of course the great gossip. So the gossip is out on Tietjens with Valentine from 1911. That's already been established when they were seen on the back roads of Kent when Campion ploughed into the horse with his motor car. And now they're going to start gossiping that he's also with Mrs Duchemin. So Tietjens now, rather than Sylvia, gets completely confirmed as the one being unfaithful, rather than Sylvia. This is going to be part of his ruin in part 3, a three-pronged ruin of societal chatter, financial problems, and of course from Tietjens' own internal stirring. Right, the end of the parade has begun. The mother has died. His professionalism with the Department of Statistics gets threatened because once the war begins, everything. Remember, he refused to do the calculations for the Liberal minister because it's too political over the pure statistics of the department, which Tietjens enjoys. Well, once the war begins, everything becomes political, and they're told to entirely make up numbers for political ends. And so he leaves the department. But again, it's his own disillusionment, the end of the parade, the end of the statistical parade, the end of the sentimental parade with his mother. And so you're beginning to see that those internal convulsions coupled with the personal and professional. Wannop, of course, takes the war quite emotionally. Her mother, writing for the Tory paper, it's the 1914 years, so she's quite belligerent at that point, thinking the war justified, end the Krauts and so on. The son, having been gone through Magdalen and Eton and becoming a communist in the meantime, wants a workers' revolution and is disgusted by the war as well. So they start bickering, and Valentine in the meantime realises that Mrs Duchemin has become pregnant through her affair with Macmaster, and of course that ends her Valentine's pure view of that relationship, because time is not yet right, the Mr Duchemin funds are not yet out, so Mrs Duchemin seeks to have an abortion, and she tries to get Valentine to use her ties with Tietjens because she believes the 1911 rumours that she has been Tietjens' mistress since then, to see if she can arrange something for her. But of course Valentine is still at this point completely innocent and one of chastity. So Ford drops you into Valentine's world when the wars already broke out, and we get a sense of this sort of conflicts she would have witnessed. The girl's crying softly and continuously. It was the first moment of the lifting of strain that she had known since the day before the Germans crossed the Belgian frontier near a place called Gemmenich. It had begun with the return of Mrs Duchemin from Scotland. She had sent at once from Mrs Wannop to the rectory late at night, by the light of candles and tall silver sticks against oak panelling. She had seemed like a mad block of marble, with staring dark eyes and mad hair. She had exclaimed in a voice as hard as a machine's, "How do you get rid of a baby? You've been a servant, you ought to know." And of course Valentine reflects that Mrs Duchemin should never have given her such of a sexual shock as that. It almost shocks Valentine out of her purity, out of her chastity. And so this is the 1914 closing world that Valentine and Christopher inhabit as we head towards the crucial final scene, which Stoppard has placed for us. This happens through a Valentine recollection in and around the page 230 to 235 of the Penguin's Classic. He said his goodbyes, Christopher, at this point, to Sylvia. She's distraught. Her world, her decadent world, is over. Tietjens is off to war. Her idea that she'd be chased and live by him and have some sort of overcoming redemptive arc is over because he's going off to war, probably to die. She said goodbye to how she resists the likes of Brownlee now, And so Christopher heads to the beginning of what will be known as, the Macmaster's Fridays, the presupposed society of beautiful intellects, centering in London around the friends of Vincent Macmaster, and at this point still not Miss Macmaster, but Mrs Duchemin. We also in this scene get introduced to the character Ruggles, a lodger with Mark. He'll become influential to the spreading of malicious rumour about Christopher, which will lead to his ruin, a sort of pivotal moment of Christopher's ruin in episode 3. But we're not there yet, but there's Ruggles lurking in the background scheming. Christopher, of course, has no poker face, and his lack of respect for the man is pertinently shown. So Ruggles dissolves away the other characters of Macmaster's Fridays dissolve away, similar to how all of the others at the table at breakfast at Duchemin's in the previous episode dissolved away, and you're left with the one-on-one dialogue between Christopher and Valentine. It was a November day. This is established by Ford, so we've reached November 1914 before Tietjens decides to have this moment of joining the army. And this is how Valentine recollects it, according to Ford. "Well, Mrs. Wannop, what have you been doing?" And they drifted into talking of the war. You couldn't not. She was astonished not to find him so loathsome as she had expected. For, just at that time, with the facts that were always being driven into her mind by the pacifists, friends of her brother, and with continual brooding over the morals of Mrs. Duchemin, she had an automatic feeling that all manly men were lust-filled devils, desiring nothing better than to stride over battlefields, stabbing the wounded with long daggers in frenzies of sadism. She knew that this view of Tietjens was wrong, but she cherished it. And then we get this Valentine saying that Christopher described his disillusionment it had cost him personally as soon as this country had come into the war. He even described the sunlit heather landscape of the north, where naively he had made his tranquil resolution to join the French Foreign Legion as a common soldier, and his conviction that that would give him, as he called it, clean bones again. One could have fought with a clean heart for a civilization, if you like, for the 18th century against the 20th, since that was what fighting for France against the enemy countries meant. But our coming in had changed the aspect for once. It was one part of the 20th century using the 18th as a cat's paw to bash the other half of the 20th. It was true there was nothing else for it. As long as we did it in a decent spirit, it was just bearable. So he has this complete over-idealistic vision of France as this 18th century country, mainly because it hadn't industrialized to the same extent as Britain and Germany. But nevertheless, it fleshes out his ability that this was the purifying scene in 1914, was to head to France and to fight for something to stir oneself, rather than to let it all drift by and then to say, "I told you so." And the words of Wannop from the first episode still rushing through his head. And I'll just conclude with some lines from Ford. Of course, we'll get into his actual war, his writings on the war in episodes 4 and 5, but for now, such infinite deaths of men, such an infinite prolongation. This is Wannop's view. And Tietjens, of course, actually tells her, "I have nothing to live for. What I stand for isn't any more in this world. What I want, I can't have. Macmaster here will do my jobs. He won't do them so well, but he'll do them more dishonestly. He'll do them with enthusiasm and righteousness. He'll fulfill the order of his superiors with an immense delicacy and unction." Of course, Tietjens, to a calculating point, even comes out and says we ought to have snaffled other people's colonies at the price of neutrality. So there's more going around through Tietjens' head here than perhaps is shown in the show. Perhaps views that Stoppard deemed that we couldn't give if it was still treat Tietjens in a favourable light, but nonetheless.
Well, I came over to tell Macmaster I'm joining the army. I hoped we respected each other, at least I tremendously respect you, and I hoped you'd respect me too. You don't respect me? Well, I would have liked you to have said it.
What difference does it make when there's all this pain, this torture? I haven't slept a whole night since. I believe pain and fear must be worse at night.
Dear. So queer. My wife used almost exactly the words you used not an hour ago. She, too, said that she couldn't respect me.
We have to do everything we can not to lose our men, don't you see? Besides, you know, you are more useful here.
They'll never have me back. The sentimentalist must be stoned to death. He makes everyone uncomfortable.
You shouldn't be proud of despising your country.
I don't believe that. I love every field and hedgerow. The land is England, and once it was the foundation of order, before money took over and handed the country over to the swindlers and schemers. Toryism of the pig's trough.
Then what is your Toryism?
Duty. Duty and service to above and below, frugality, keeping your word, honouring the past, looking after your people, and beggaring yourself if need be before letting duty go hang. If we'd stayed out of it, I'd have gone over to France to fight for France, for agriculture against industrialism, for the 18th century against the 20th, if you like. Hoped you'd understand.
Oh, I understand you. You're as innocent about yourself as a child. You would have thought all the same things in the 18th century.
Of course I would, and I would have been right. But you do make one collect one's thoughts. Do you remember our ride in the mist, what you said about me 3 years ago? Well, I'm not that man now.
What? I can't remember.
I'm not an English country gentleman who let the country go to hell and never stir himself except to say, I told you so.
Yes. I said that. I said you ought to be in a museum. I think I wanted to provoke you into bursting out of your glass cabinet.
Now it's a choice between bad and worse. Well, I have this big hulking body to throw into the war. Nothing much to live for. Because you know what I want, I can't have.
What is it I know?
What I stand for is gone.
But to live for? You have something to live for.
What's that?
The war breaks out. All those who thought the world muddied in 1911 now find it cataclysmic. Those who thought it was clear and crisp now find it muddied. And so Macmaster rises up. He's going to get a knighthood in the way Tietjens expressed through his dishonesty. Wannops joins the pacifist movement. She can't deal with the suffering. And Tietjens heads to the front to stir himself into action at the end of this world. And we're left with the 4 words that Stoppard gladly gives us on page 228, that across that dreadful phantasmagoria went the figure of Tietjens. Till next time.